welcome. I'm Jean McKnight, Planning Board Chair, and this joint open meeting of the Select Board, the Planning Board, and the Finance Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with current state regulations, and is being recorded. Public access to this meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless required by law. This particular meeting will not have public comment. First, we'll confirm that all members of the, or that perhaps not all, but that the members of the Select Board and the Planning Board and the Finance Committee are present. So when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. I'll start with the Select Board. Marianne Cooley.
Here.
Maurice Handel.
Here.
John Bullion.
Here.
Matthew Borelli. Well, I don't know if perhaps Matthew is not joining us or he may be joining us later. And Dan Matthews. Dan Matthews is not here right now either. Now, members of the Finance Committee. Louise Misgerd. Not present. I'm working from a list, so forgive me if, excuse me, Louise is actually Finance Committee staff. I'm sorry about that. I see, and excuse me?
Louise just joined.
Oh, Louise did just join.
Hi, Barry. Hi, Jean.
Hi, Louise. And
Okay.
on the Finance Committee, Barry Kaufman.
I'm here.
John Conley.
I'm here.
Carol Smith Fischetti. Carol is not present yet. Thomas Jacob. Right. Not here. Joshua Levy.
Yes, I'm on.
Yes. Richard Lunetta. Here. Louise Miller. Richard Riley. All right, so for the Finance Committee, we have present Carol Smith Fischetti, Thomas Jacob, Richard Lunetta, and Louise Miller, as well as Finance Committees. Excuse me, I read the ones who are not here. Let me begin again. For the Finance Committee, we have staff Louise Misgerd, and we have members Barry Kaufman, John Conley, Joshua Levy, and Richard Riley. And for the Select Board, I know we have Marianne Cooley and Maurice Handel and John Bullion, and I will.
Dan Matthews has joined us.
Oh, all right. So Dan Matthews is here also. Yes. So it's only Matt Borelli who's not here. So now the Planning Board. Martin Jacobs.
I'm here.
And Ted Owens.
Here.
Paul Alpert.
Here.
Adam Block.
Here.
Yeah.
Please, if my voice is echoing, please let me know. I do sometimes have that difficulty with my system, but I don't think that was me. So now let me introduce the staff. Lee Newman, a director of Planning and Community Development.
Present.
Economic Development Manager, Amy Howson.
Present.
Yes.
Hello.
Town Engineer, Tony Delgazo.
Here.
Town Manager, Kate Fitzpatrick.
Here.
Public Information Officer, Cindy Roy Gonzalez.
Here.
Assistant Town Manager and Director of Finance, Dave Davidson. Okay, I don't hear Dave Davidson here. Assistant Town Manager, Director of Operations, Katie King.
Here.
All right, so those are board members and town staff. Now let me introduce the persons here as our engineering consultants with Greenman Peterson Inc. or GPI. John Diaz. Okay, so we don't have John Diaz. Rebecca Brown.
Here.
Douglas Halpert.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
And I did see that John joined at one point, so I don't know if he's muted, but he had joined at one point. He may have dropped off.
So John Diaz will likely be joining us.
He will be joining us.
Dropped off,
he was
perhaps.
on, and it looks like he dropped off. So
Perhaps just briefly. All right. So let me go on. I just want to say for those participating in the meeting, please be aware that others may be able to see you. Anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. And all supporting materials for this meeting, including the agenda, are available on the town's website, www.mass.gov. And the ground rules for this meeting are designed to allow for an accurate public record. Each of the speakers on our agenda will be introduced, and after they conclude their remarks, I assume that each board member will be asked by name for any comment, questions, or motions, and all votes will be at this meeting will be by roll call. The nature of this meeting is such that it's probably unlikely that there will be votes, but in case there are, there will be by roll call. Now, a working group was formed in May to study the proposed rezoning of the Muzzy Motors and Channel 5 properties on Highland Avenue and Gould Street. And those properties are now in the Industrial 1 zoning district. As the first stage of that work, the town engaged the engineering firm Greenman Peterson Inc., GPI, to undertake a traffic impact study of a potential build out of the site if it were to be rezoned. Select board member Marianne Cooley, who chairs the working group, will moderate this meeting. So I turn over the virtual gavel to Ms. Cooley.
So first of all, I want to thank the working group for the work that they've done so far. As you will all recall, there was collective agreement among all three boards that the town benefited by pursuing a rezoning of this particular parcel in Highway Commercial 1. That leaving it as it is currently zoned resulted in lessening the value over time if it was to proceed with rezoning or with being redeveloped under the current zoning. So that was the genesis of the original work in the working group that was done. The concern that was heard originally when this proposal came to town meeting really was largely around traffic. So it was determined that we needed to do more work on the traffic. That was what the working group pursued and why GPI was engaged. Then we had a pandemic, and the question of traffic became a non-issue. So The group then needed to discuss how we could get a traffic study without traffic that could consider what the worst case or maximum build out would look like. And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to GPI to take us through the work that they've done to understand what that maximum build out might look like and what the assumptions were that were used.
All right.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Marianne. So this is Rebecca Brown from Greenman Peterson. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the traffic study that we were prepared, or that we prepared, what we were asked to do by the town, and what the conclusions were that we came out with at the end in terms of what transportation infrastructure needs there would be to be able to accommodate a rezone of this size. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And hopefully you can all see that presentation slide now. Perfect. So what we were asked to look at was essentially the rezoning of the Muzzy Ford site and the Channel 5 site that's located here. And that rezoning was to include just under 870,000 square feet of space. That was roughly broken out into about 370,000 square feet of corporate office space and another 370,000 square feet of research and development, or R&D space. And then along with that would also be 130,000 square feet of ancillary retail uses. Those retail uses would really be designed as a use for the corporate office and R&D space as an amenity to those uses. So it would be like coffee shops, barber shops, things like that would provide services for the employees of the office and the R&D space to be able to use during the day. The study area that we looked at as part of this traffic study included the intersections along Central Avenue, starting at the Gould Street intersection, the Hampton Avenue intersection, and the River Park Street intersection here. Running along Gould Street, we also looked at the intersections of Ellis Street, Kearney Road, the two site driveways, and the intersection of Highland Avenue and Hunting Road. And you can see here this kind of 5A and 5, these two intersections are essentially the same, but it's looking at separated driveways versus a consolidated driveway. So to do this traffic study, obviously one thing that was brought up was that traffic is a little bit different right now with the pandemic. So we weren't able to actually go out and collect new traffic counts as part of this study. But there was a former study that was done by Beta Engineering back in 2015 that included all of these same intersections that was done for a previous rezoning effort of the same property and some additional property within the town. So we looked at the traffic volumes from that Beta Engineering study. We also were able to get some more updated counts from 2019 from a study that McMahon did following the widening of the Route 128 through this area to add a lane in each direction. So following that work being done, some counts were done to look at how they compared to pre and post construction of the 128 widening project. So we were able to get counts at the intersection of Highland Avenue and Gould Street for that 2019 time period. We were also able to get counts at the Gould Street and Central Avenue intersection. And when we compared the 2015 to 2019 traffic counts, what we found was that there was actually a decrease in traffic between 2015 and 2019. A pretty large portion of that decrease was for the left turns from Highland Avenue onto Hunting Road and the right turns from Hunting Road onto Highland Avenue, which may have likely been the result of detours that were happening while that Route 128 widening was going on that had actually detoured traffic down Highland, or on Highland Avenue down Hunting Road to get access to the ramps while the ramps at Highland Avenue were being reconstructed. The remaining movements through these intersections saw only a slight decrease. So based on there being a decrease between 2015 and 2019, we actually used the 2015 traffic volumes as they were for those intersections where we did not have new data. We didn't apply any type of growth rate to grow those up to a 2020 condition based on the fact that the 2015 was higher and would be more conservative. For the two intersections where we did have 2019 data, we did use that 2019 data as being the most recent traffic volumes that were collected. We also did a review of the collision history at the study area intersections. And what we found here was that the majority of the intersections have crash rates that are well below the state and district-wide averages. The only real exception to that was the Highland Avenue and Hunting Road and Gould Street intersection, where there were 46 crashes that occurred over the 5-year study period, and a crash rate that was higher than the statewide average. One of the reasons that we believe that that was so high was actually due to the construction that was ongoing, based on the type of crashes that have occurred at that location. So we do anticipate that following that construction being complete, that there would be a reduction in the number of crashes that would occur at that location. So once we had this existing conditions data, we looked at projecting traffic volumes out to a 10-year design condition, so a 2030 condition. And to do this, we grew the traffic volumes out at a rate of 1% per year. And that's a pretty standard growth rate that's used throughout the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts that accounts for kind of your general background growth in the area. And based on the fact that we've seen a negative trend in traffic volumes from 2015 to 19, that 1% per year is probably a conservative growth rate. In addition to growing the traffic volumes out to a 2030 condition, we also included planned roadway improvements in our traffic impact analysis. One of those roadway improvements included the ongoing work that's being done right now by Mass DOT at the Highland Avenue, Hunting Road and Gould Street intersection, which is essentially a pedestrian and bicycle improvement project and a safety improvement project. So they are adding bicycle lanes, separated bicycle lanes in each direction along Highland Avenue, upgrading the pedestrian crossings through the intersection, and then optimizing the signal timings to get a little bit better operations for the intersection itself. However, it's not a capacity improvement project. So there are no additional lanes or anything like that that would be provided as part of that project. So the only real capacity improvements is for the retiming of the intersection. So the next thing that we did was estimate how much traffic would actually be generated by this project. So we looked at how much traffic would be generated by each of the individual uses on a daily basis, and then as well during the weekday morning and afternoon peak hours, your typical commuter peak hours for the corporate office space, the R&D space, and the retail space. Now, I mentioned that the retail uses are really intended to be ancillary to the office type uses that will be on the site. They're intended to serve as an amenity and not expected to generate a large volume of new traffic from the roadway. So we did take credit for the trips that would be shared between the retail uses on site and the office uses on site. And that's where we come up with this total external trips column that you see here. So this is how many new trips would be generated out onto the roadway system. Now for the retail use, there is obviously some pass-by traffic that would happen where somebody may be on their way to work, stop into a coffee shop or something, or a dry cleaners that might be located on the site and then continue along their way, getting on the highway and heading off to work. So based on Institute of Transportation Engineers data, or ITE data, about 26 to 34%, depending on the hour of the day, of retail uses is generally passed by traffic. So that's what we applied here in this column is passed by traffic. Now there is also existing uses on the site, obviously with the Muzzy Ford and the Channel 5. So we did subtract out the existing traffic that is being generated by the site today based on those 2015 traffic counts that were collected. And what we're left here with is this last column that is the new traffic that would be generated by this project. So in the morning, the project would generate about 620 new vehicle trips out on the roadway. And in the afternoon, about 870 new trips would be generated. We were also asked to examine an alternative condition that would replace a portion of the project with 226 units of residential development. And so we went through the same exact steps looking at the residential development and compared what would happen if we were to replace some of that office and R&D space with a residential use. And what we find here is that on a daily basis, that build program would generate just under 2,000 trips less than the office and R&D uses would. And during the peak hours in the morning, it would be about 130 trips less, and in the afternoon, about 240 trips less. So the next step that we did once we estimated how much traffic would be generated by the project was to actually distribute that traffic out over the roadway network. To do this, we looked at a number of different factors. The first being just existing travel patterns in the area, turning on and off of Gould Street, and where people are generally coming from. The next thing that we looked at was a journey to work model, since the majority of the people coming to the site will be office employees. We looked at people who work in the surrounding area, generally what their place of residency is. And then the last thing that we looked at was a building density model to look at within about a 30-minute driving radius of the site, where are the buildings located? And that really applies more to a retail type use, where people coming from a retail could be coming from their home, they could be coming from an office building, they could be coming from any type of building use to get to a retail use. Looking at all three of those different methods, the trip distribution came out pretty similar. So we had about 15% of the traffic coming from each direction along Central Avenue, about 10% of the traffic coming from the west on Highland Avenue, about 20% from the south on Hunting Road, and about 40% from the east along Highland Avenue. And that 40% includes traffic that would be coming to and from Route 128 as well. So that's people coming from Highland Ave east of the highway or coming off of the highway would be included in that 40%. So when we distribute that out over the roadway network, this figure here just shows you what that traffic actually looks like in terms of traffic volumes going through each of the city area intersections. So you can see down at the Highland Avenue and Hunting Road intersection that there's a pretty substantial increase in traffic through this intersection, particularly for the left turn in the afternoon coming off of Gould Street, and that right turn in the morning turning on to Gould Street, because of that 40% of the traffic that we saw coming to and from the highway. So then we added that site generated traffic onto our no build condition to get our 2030 build traffic volumes that you can see here in this figure. So once we had those build traffic volumes, we did a capacity and queue analysis where we looked at the amount of delay on each approach through each of the study area intersections under our no build conditions, which are shown on the left-hand side of each one of these little bubbles. So the top left-hand corner represents the weekday morning in a no-build condition. The bottom left-hand corner is the PM condition in our no-build. And then on the right-hand side represents our build condition. So when you compare the left side to the right side, you can see what the impact of this development would be on the operations of each intersection. And the level of service that you see here, these A, B, C, are very similar to a grading system in school. A being good, very little delay going through an intersection. B being a little bit of delay, but still good. And an F being at a failing condition, where potentially maybe not all of the traffic is getting through an intersection on each cycle of the light, or there may be long queues that are forming at an unsignalized intersection where there's just not enough gaps in the through traffic for vehicles to be able to get out. So this diagram is color-coded to show you wherever you see the greens and the yellows, the intersections are generally operating at a strong level of service with no real traffic operations issues. Where we start to see these red E's and F's, those are where there are some issues popping up. So based on this level of service comparison, looking at our no build condition to our build condition, what you can see here is that there are really 3 intersections where there are significant issues that are occurring. One is at the Central Avenue and Gould Street intersection. And that intersection, I'm sure for anyone who's driven through there, has seen that that intersection really has some existing capacity constraints. It only has 1 lane in each direction. Gould Street is unsignalized. So that traffic can back up down Gould Street pretty significantly, both in the morning and in the afternoon. And as a result, there is some cut-through traffic that happens through the neighborhood here with people trying to get around the traffic signal, or excuse me, the intersection there. The other place where we see an issue is at the site driveway itself, for traffic trying to get out of the site driveway, where we can see that that would be operating at level of service F. And the last place where we see significant issues is at the intersection of Highland Avenue and Gould Street. This intersection today, or I should say in 2030, with the improvements that are proposed as part of the MassDOT project, will be pretty close to capacity on several movements. So any additional traffic that goes through that intersection will push that intersection over capacity. So as a result, we have several movements that are operating at level of service E or F in that build condition. So obviously the next step for us was to look at, okay, so what can be done about this? How can we improve this to get back to a no build condition? So looking at the Central Avenue and Gould Street intersection, we ran a signal warrant analysis to assess whether a traffic signal was warranted at that intersection based on the traffic volumes that are traveling through. And what we found was that the existing traffic volumes through this intersection are already meeting a warrant for installation of a traffic signal. So we have shown here installation of a traffic signal at the Central Avenue and Gould Street intersection. We've also shown on the Central Avenue westbound approach to the intersection, reassigning the right-of-way here, or reallocating the right-of-way to be able to provide a through lane and a dedicated left turn lane because of the heavy left turn volume that turns onto Gould Street. In order to construct these improvements, there are some easements that would be required to be able to accommodate this right-hand turn for trucks coming around this corner. The radius on this intersection will need to be widened out. That does fit entirely within the existing right-of-way, but an easement would be required to construct the sidewalk and install the signal equipment on this corner. Similarly, in order for a truck to be able to make this right-hand turn onto Gould Street, This corner here would also need to be widened just slightly. So there is a slight area in here where an easement would be required to be able to accommodate the sidewalk that would be outside of the existing right-of-way and the 2 signal poles. Those poles would be located just barely outside of the right-of-way, so we'd have a slight easement around those poles as well. And then on the north side of the roadway, everything fits within the existing right-of-way, but there would be an easement that would be required for the signal mast arm to be able to get access within a 5-foot radius around that mast arm if there were repairs and things that needed to be done. So the other area that really requires a pretty significant improvement is from the intersection of Highland Avenue all the way down through the 2 site driveways. So looking at this, we started by looking at whether each of the site driveways individually would require a traffic signal. What we found was that the traffic volumes at the northerly site driveway did not meet the warrants for a traffic signal. Even though this intersection was minorly at a level of service F, it still had a volume to capacity ratio that was less than 1, which is essentially a measure of whether or not there's enough gaps in traffic for vehicles to be able to exit. So even though a car might have to wait a long time to get out, there are enough gaps across that peak hour for all the cars that would be leaving the site to be able to get out. So we found here that there were enough gaps for vehicles to get out, so a signal was not warranted at this location. But it would require separate left and right turn lanes exiting the driveway, as well as a left turn lane entering the driveway to be able to handle that large volume of traffic that would be coming down Gould Street and entering into the site at that northerly driveway. At the southerly site driveway, we found that a traffic signal is warranted based on the heavy left turn volume that would be headed down towards Highland Avenue to get to the highway leaving the site. We also found that we needed 2 left turn lanes exiting the site, even with a traffic signal, to be able to accommodate that volume, which was roughly about 700 left turns coming out of that driveway. In order to be able to accommodate those 2 turning lanes exiting, we needed to have 2 receiving lanes on Gould Street to be able to receive that traffic headed into the Highland Avenue intersection. What we also found was that the queues with a 1-lane approach on Gould Street southbound were about 700 feet long if we had just a single lane coming through this intersection. So that 700-foot queue would extend about 450 feet beyond the north driveway, which would make it very difficult for traffic to ever actually get out of the north driveway under an unsignalized situation. So because of that, we propose providing 2 travel lanes on the southbound approach. And with that, the queues were reduced down to about 250 feet with 2 southbound travel lanes, which is about the same distance between the southerly driveway and the northerly driveway. So with that, the northerly driveway would rarely be blocked by queues headed southbound at the south driveway. We also found that we needed a dedicated right turn lane into the site at this intersection here to be able to accommodate that heavy traffic volume in the morning that would be coming in, which again was pretty close to 700 vehicles turning right into the site in the morning. Coming down to the Highland Avenue Hunting Road intersection, right now this approach has a left turn lane and a shared through left and right turn lane. And what we found that was actually needed was 2 dedicated left turn lanes going on to Highland Avenue to be able to accommodate that 700 vehicles that are coming out of the site, in addition to a very heavy volume that's already out there today turning left. And then we also needed a dedicated through lane onto Hunting Road and a dedicated right turn lane turning onto Highland Avenue, headed to the west of the site. The other approaches on Highland Avenue, Hunting Road, and the westbound approach of Highland Avenue, all essentially stayed the same, with the exception of, because of that heavy volume that's coming off of the highway and turning right onto Gould Street, we also needed a dedicated right turn lane on the Highland Avenue approach. And providing that dedicated right turn lane under a channelized condition would essentially eliminate that garden that's on this corner today. So there's kind of like a garden with a little pond and everything that's right on this corner today. So providing that channelized turn lane requires removal of that garden and widening outside of the area of the Mass DOT improvements that are under construction today. So to construct all of these improvements, we assumed that there would be no property takings and minimal easements required along the westerly side of the roadway on Gould Street, and that any widening that was done would be done towards the site itself. So what you can see here highlighted in this orange color is property that would be required to be essentially donated from the site to provide that widening. So it would impact the developable land as part of the site in order to be able to provide that widening. And these are just showing kind of zoomed in views of each of those locations. So you can see kind of the two left turn lanes coming through here, the through lane, and you can see kind of this widening that occurs through this, this pond and garden area. And again, this is at the site driveway. So you can see this blue line represents the existing right-of-way. And this hatched area represents the amount of widening that would be required into the site. And again, this is at the northerly driveway where you can see the widening that would be required into the site. So one of the things that we looked at was kind of a secondary alternative of what if we were to consolidate the two driveways into just one driveway, and at the place of the northerly driveway, we just allowed a right turn slip out so that those vehicles that are headed north towards Central Avenue could get out through this location without having to go through the consolidated driveway at the traffic signal. So this figure is showing what the impacts here would be. It does not change the operations at Highland Avenue and Hunting Road. That intersection would still see the same volume of traffic with or without the consolidated driveway. So that the improvements that are proposed at this location do not change. However, because we don't need to have 2 lanes of traffic coming southbound, because we don't need to worry about left turns coming out of this driveway, we can provide a single travel lane coming southbound through here. What that does is it eliminates that, that property impact that we had seen here, where this was all shaded in orange to provide a widening into the site to accommodate that second southbound travel lane. So that gets eliminated here. Because we don't need to have 2 travel lanes, we also lose the large island that we had here to be able to shadow out the left turn lane. So that pushes the widening in this area back in as well. So there's significantly less impacts by providing a consolidated driveway to the developable land on the Muzzy Ford property. Otherwise, the traffic operations are fairly similar at this signalized intersection with and without the consolidated driveways. So the last thing we did was look at what are the impacts of implementing all of these traffic mitigation measures, and what does that do to the operations at each of the intersections. So now what you're seeing on the left-hand side of each of these is the no build condition, and the right-hand side represents the build with the mitigation measures that we just walked through. For these intersections that are kind of faded back, there is actually no mitigation that's required. their operations under build conditions were comparable to a no build condition, or we're at a level of service D or better, which is generally considered an acceptable condition. So there's no mitigation that's required there. But at the intersection of Central Avenue and Gould Street, we can see here that the Gould Street approach goes from a level of service F with pretty long delays and queues down to still at a level of service E in the morning. But again, that volume to capacity ratio comes well below a 1.0, so that there's more than enough capacity there to be able to handle the amount of traffic. And in the afternoon, this is at a level of service C. We do see obviously Central Avenue approaches get worse with the build with mitigation condition. And that's because right now those are operating at a free flow condition. But in the build with mitigation condition, they would be signalized, so that traffic will have to stop to allow the Gould Street traffic to actually exit. But those are all at a level of service D or better, which is generally considered acceptable and a good design for a signalized intersection. At both of the site driveway intersections, all of the movements will be operating at a level of service D or better. At the Highland Avenue and Hunting Road intersection, we'll still have some movements that are operating at a level of service E, but we do generally bring all of the movements back to a no build condition. And there's some that are operating a little bit better than no build, and some that are slightly worse than no build condition. But that's really due to re-optimization of the timings through that intersection, so that we are minimizing the amount of total delay in queuing through that intersection. And with that, I guess we can open it up to any questions if you have them. That's pretty much the end of our presentation for the impacts and what would be required for improvements for the project. So if there's specific questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
So
Thank you, Rebecca. Can you unshare just so we can see everybody?
Sure.
Okay. Carol, is that you with a question?
yes, and the last screen kind of brought out the question anyhow, but that's fine. I'm wondering, so even with the proposed modifications in traffic, we still have a few areas that are D and F. So what would it take to rectify that situation so the level of service is more acceptable? Like, what would it take in terms of cost or takings of land? What else would need to be done?
So yeah, one of those is obviously the Gould Street at Central Avenue intersection, where I mentioned in the morning that's at a level of service E still. So to be able to rectify that, it would require construction of an additional lane on Gould Street, so that you'd have separate left and right turn lanes there. And that would require a property taking on one or potentially both of those corners. You likely could do it with just a property taking on the southeast corner by providing a dedicated right turn lane with the taking of that property. The other location is obviously down at the Highland Avenue, Hunting Road, and Gould Street intersection. Now, part of the reason that you still see level of service E on some of those movements is because the cycle length at that signal is required to be so long to be able to accommodate every single movement, that some movements have to wait a long time before it goes from red back to green again, just so that all the other movements can be serviced. There are no movements there under a build with mitigation condition that are going to have a volume to capacity ratio greater than 1. Those movements that you do see at a level of service E are generally the lower volume movements. So that is the left turn headed eastbound on Highland Avenue towards the highway that turns left onto Gould Street. That's a relatively low volume movement, and that movement's operating at a level of service E because it gets a very small amount of the green time of the entire cycle. So those cars are waiting a long time just so that the other movements can be served. But the queues don't extend past the available storage, and there's plenty of capacity there. So it's not typically something that necessarily would get mitigated. The only way to really mitigate those types of level of service ease that you see on those low volume left turns would be to add a lot more capacity on the other approaches so that they don't need such a long green time. There would be a pretty substantial right-of-way impact there to be able to construct any additional travel lanes through that intersection. Where the greatest need is on the Hunting Road northbound approach, where right now that approach has a shared left turn and through lane and a dedicated right turn lane. And that really should be 3 lanes on that approach. So it should have a dedicated left lane, dedicated through lane, and a dedicated right turn lane. And that would require some widening and property takings, either sliver widening to do slight property takings on each side, or more substantial takings on one side of the road, to be able to get rid of those level of service E's and bring all of the intersection back down to a level of service D or better.
Okay, and those property takings are not reflected on your schematics.
They are not, correct.
Okay.
So we were trying to bring the intersection back to the no build condition so that it is no worse than it is under the no build condition. So kind of a do no harm type of situation.
Yeah, I guess just philosophically from my perspective, if we're going to be doing this and asking for zoning modifications to accommodate this project, and then presumably asking our citizenry to undertake a lot of delay while the project is constructing, I feel like we need to do better than bringing it back to what it was.
Right.
That's me.
Understood.
Thanks.
All right. I see John has his hand up. John Bullion.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a good presentation. Rebecca, can you bring up the intersection? I just want to go back to the northbound on Hunting Road and bring the intersection of Hunting, Gould, and Highland back into the screen.
Sure. That's this one here.
Thank you. And then I want to carry forward from what you were just speaking about with respect to Hunting northbound, because I travel that route regularly on a daily basis.
Rebecca, can you just share that screen while John's talking? Thank you.
Sorry. Thought I had it shared, but I hadn't clicked the final button.
Okay.
So John.
So right now, the way the diagram looks to me, number one, the Adeline project, from my perspective, I live down near right at exit 18 on 128. And the hope was that by adding the lane northbound on both sides of 128, that the traffic getting off of 128 at exit 18 and coming up Hunting northbound was going to recede, because the additional volume capacity available from 128 would reduce the need for people to get off and seek the alternate route. That didn't happen. So there is still volume that pushes up, and a lot of volume that pushes up Greendale, from which then goes into Hunting once you get past Kendrick northbound. So if we do a build out at the Muzzy site, there's going to be traffic coming from both north and south on 128. What I'm looking at is that there will be more traffic exiting at exit 18 off of 128 to pick up Greendale North, which will then intersect and continue flowing up to Hunting, as you were saying. But I think we may be underestimating the amount of traffic that Hunting Road will need to take northbound, going straight across to the new Muzzy built out site. So 2 questions. Number one, it looks as though from the diagram that the northbound lane, straight through lane on Hunting, goes sort of, it looks as though it's not, and maybe it's the diagram and the way it's set out, doesn't go straight. It has to sort of jog to the right to get into the straight lane on Gould Street. And that's going to be a problem because there will be traffic, and more traffic coming from Hunting. The other question is, I think as part of a build out of Muzzy, I do believe it will be necessary to do what you just indicated with a right turn, a straight, and a left turn lane dedicated on Hunting Road in order to be able to manage the traffic that we will have in the morning rush hour coming up northbound on Hunting Road from Greendale from 128. So my question is, am I not seeing this right, that the straight lane from Hunting North, it looks as though it's going into the left turn lane when I sort of just across. So is that?
Yeah, you are correct. So to be able to accommodate the widening to provide 2 additional lanes on Gould Street coming southbound, that pushes the receiving lane towards the Muzzy Ford site. So as you're coming through here, it's pretty faint. I don't know how well you can see it from the screen share, but there are these dashed lines that kind of.
I see the tracer lines. I'm going to say, yeah, and I don't know whether there's a way of correcting that, but there's going to be more volume coming Hunting northbound to access whatever is in the Muzzy site, and I don't know whether that will be how problematic from your perspective as a traffic engineer for the traffic to follow that. I know that, just as in a similar way, moving up Highland Ave into Newton, they just straightened Christina Street and Oak Street so that they were, so that they're more even with each other instead of having to go up and make more of a left turn to get to what should be a straight road across an intersection. So my concern is that would be a problem that's created. I can't tell by the angular elements of these tracer markings how much of a curve that's going to be. I'm simply pointing it out as something to take a further look at. But I do believe that the Hunting right, straight, and left should be dealt with as part of any rebuild of the Muzzy site. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, John. I think Mo had his hand up next.
Thank you. A couple of questions and/or comments. I have a particular bias which says to me that to the extent that you can make traffic conditions more efficient, you invite more traffic. And I think that particularly applies to through traffic. That's one, and it's just an observation. Two, I don't know about the effect of, one, traffic mitigation requirements that the planning board would levy on site development. Three, we're in the middle of a inflection point in terms of traffic and working habits and coming out of this pandemic. I think work patterns and hour patterns in terms of when people work and or commute or don't commute and work from home are very, very different than we think they're going to be. So I would be very cautious about sinking a lot of resource into optimizing traffic flow. And I would concentrate more on how is this site likely to be used? What do we think the range of possibilities of managing traffic into and out of that site and the balance of uses? And I noticed in the analysis, residential greatly reduces the net traffic that comes in and out of this site at peak times. So I would just throw all of those into the mix as we try to think about this.
Absolutely. And you have a very good point about the change in the travel trends, because we're already seeing that happen all over the place where people are traveling at all different hours now. So daily traffic volumes are actually not all that different than they were prior to the pandemic. But what we're seeing is a kind of flattening of the curves, where some people are only working a few hours a day during or in their offices. So they may be traveling at different times. So rather than having these two big lumps in the day, in the morning and the afternoon, we're kind of seeing this plateauing effect of traffic throughout the day. So
So Rebecca, one of the things that we could think about asking you to look at would be if the traffic were more even, what does that traffic look like at this kind of an hour? Just out of curiosity, and how does that compare, right?
Yep, we could.
I'm just trying to think about what some possibilities are. And I do know we did ask GPI to take a look at a residential component. Residential had not been recommended for this site by the planning board, and nor was it recommended actually by the select board when that was last discussed. But we did want to look at it because residents had asked us to look at that. This is not a site that really meets transit-oriented development. It's not near public transit, as we're seeing from all these cars then that would have to travel to it. But it did give us a feel of, is the traffic better or worse at the peak hour if residential were there? So that is a factor there. I think I'm not seeing the blue hands anymore, but I did see Josh raise a hand. So Josh.
Thanks, Marianne. Yeah, and thanks, Rebecca. This was a really helpful presentation. Similar to John, I actually had a question about a particular intersection at Central and Gould. So I guess before the pandemic, that's an intersection that I'm familiar with. In the morning, I know that traffic from the Elliott Street intersection in Newton will back up sometimes all the way to this intersection. And so I know in the pre-build, going along going along Central with Gould Street on the right, I guess that's the eastbound traffic. Pre-build that would be pre-build that eastbound traffic would be, I guess, a grade A, and then post-build, even with an intersection, it would be grade D. So I guess in practical terms, what would that mean? Would that mean that traffic would back up even farther, perhaps to other intersections? By West Street as far as there? I'm wondering.
Off the top of my head, I don't remember what that queue is, but I'm going to pull that up for you.
Thank you.
So that I can tell you how much further that would go. So in the morning, we saw an eastbound queue of about 870 feet with that build with mitigation. So the queue headed in the eastbound direction would go about 870 feet beyond the intersection to the west.
And I guess that already takes into account the existing or the typical morning traffic, right, where there's already a queue?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and what we would need to be able to reduce that down would be to provide a dedicated right turn lane onto Gould Street. And that cuts the queue on that approach about in half. It's actually a little bit less than half by doing that. But that would require widening along the southerly side of Central Avenue and property takings from all three of these properties that you can see right here in this image to be able to provide that right turn lane. So what we were really trying to do was get that back to kind of, like I said, a no build condition, which we actually got by just installing the signal back to even better than a no build condition. So we got something that operationally works. There was no intersections that were, or no approaches that were exceeding the capacity, but obviously we couldn't get it all the way back without taking property. And that's what we were trying to avoid doing, was taking the properties.
Yeah, that's helpful to hear. And that 870 feet is a very concrete number. I feel like that's something that residents may be concerned about, but it's really good to have that data.
Okay. Any other questions? I note that it's coming up on 9 o'clock, and I know it was on my calendar just for an hour. So, Jean. You need to unmute, Jean.
First of all, I want to respond to Mo Handel, who asked about whether the planning board would require traffic mitigation on the part of the developer of this site. And certainly we would, and we have in other circumstances. I mean, just last night we were dealing with the area known as Founders Park on the other side of the highway in the highway commercial zone. And I mean, excuse me, the business zone there, and otherwise known as Needham Crossing, that entire area. And the mitigation that was exacted from the original rezoning of and special permit of Founders Park, where TripAdvisor is and Children's Hospital is going in, was a considerable amount of money. So here, we're not only talking, as was mentioned, with a donation of easements or land to widen the roads, but certainly for traffic signalization and that sort of thing, it seems as though it, in our history has been that we would expect the property owner, who naturally we assume benefits from the rezoning, the more intense use of the property, to pay for those improvements. And I want to comment on whether this site is transit oriented. I think I noted that the distance from this site to the Needham Heights train station and the 58 bus is pretty much at that same Needham Heights location. And that's 0.8 miles. Is it true, and I'm asking our advisors, GPI, that our site is not considered transit oriented unless it's within a half mile of a transit station? Is that correct?
You are correct. Yeah, it's generally they're within a half mile. Now, that's not to say that there's not measures that could be implemented to encourage more transit trips. So for example, if they were to provide a shuttle that would take people to and from the transit station, providing a bus stop on the site is another means that they could do. There's a number of other different things they could do to try and reduce down the amount of traffic they would generate. Those are generally called transportation demand management measures. So encouraging carpools, partnering with Mass Rides and New Ride, where what they would do is they would register all of their employees. Upon hiring, they would register them with New Ride, and New Ride would help them to find ride matches that they could carpool with or do some type of ride share program to travel to work. It also provides incentives for making what are known as green trips. So if someone were to walk or bike or use public transit or carpooling, they could earn things like gift cards to coffee shops and things like that. There are also, in some cases, if you have a large employer, like because these are corporate offices, they will sometimes actually purchase vans, like 15 passenger vans that a group of people coming from a similar area could meet at a location and get in this van and travel to work together to be able to reduce down the number of trips. Obviously, some of the shift changes and things like that we've been talking about already is another way of reducing trips, or at least the peaking factor of trips. So there's a lot of different things that they could do to be able to reduce down the amount of traffic that they would generate.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. And in fact, measures like that have been imposed as conditions on the Founders Park development, and I expect that we would ask for things, for example, the shuttle, participation in the shuttle bus arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Paul, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I have multiple comments that are running through my brain as we go through this. And the first thing that I'm thinking of is that all of these improvements that sound like they really need to be made in order to have the traffic flow work here sounds very expensive, and we have not talked about cost. And Mo and Jean both talked about, would the planning board require that the developer pay for it? And my reaction is, we can say what we want, but there reaches a breaking point where a developer throws up his hands and says, it's too expensive for this to become economically viable for me to even go forward if I have to pay for all of these improvements. So I'd like to get a better feel for how much money are we talking about here? and whether that kind of money would be economically viable for a developer to pay, or whether the town would have to pay for some or all of it. And I think I'm echoing Mo to say we have no idea what the post-pandemic economy is going to bring in terms of uses of this kind of a project. We're talking about what is essentially 50% office space and 50% R&D. We don't know in case building 370,000 square feet of office space may not wind up being something that becomes economically viable, or whether people are going to say, I'm too isolated when I'm working from home. I need to go into the office and have the human contact with my coworkers, and we wind up going back to the pre-pandemic mode. We have no idea what that's going to be. And lastly, my thought is, we're talking about traffic signals at various places, and my anecdotal experience is that it takes years to get a traffic light approved and built in this Commonwealth. So I have all these questions as to whether this is even going to work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Dan?
And thank you all. This has been very helpful presentation. And although it shows us a lot about some of the challenges, as well as provides a wealth of helpful information and input. A question that I have, given that we've got a lot of stakeholders on this call, is that I don't know if it's Marianne or Jean or Lee, someone to speak to the question of what is our proposed path for this initiative? Are we what are the steps that we need to be taken to get something ready to go to town meeting that we feel will earn the members' support? Are we aiming for May? Is it a later date? A little guidance on that would be helpful.
So I guess I would speak a little bit to this, and then I'd ask Jean if she wants to comment more. I mean, the goal was to get this information so that it could inform our decision for what that path would look like. I think that we believed that the path was a path to get us to May. The question is this information, which I agree with you, Dan, is both really helpful data and illuminating of the challenges. Does this change the path? All right, because I do think that we embarked on this work because we think that there certainly was pre-pandemic. The question is, where is it now, right? The opportunity for this parcel to be redeveloped. And there is uniform agreement that redeveloping under current zoning is not beneficial to the town. That is the impetus for making a movement sooner rather than later. And if we are able to take this information from the traffic study and let that inform our work for how we think the zoning should be shaped, then being on a path to May is desirable. Jean, do you want to comment further on that?
Since I haven't been a member of the working group, I'm less able to comment, and then I rely on Marianne's comments. I did print out the work plan for the Highway Commercial One work group, and it does lead to the May 2021 annual town meeting, and we're right on schedule with our traffic study here. Well, actually, we are a little behind schedule because the traffic study completion was to be June, with a review by this select board and planning board in July. And then we anticipate a fiscal analysis as well for fiscal impact on the town. So I guess I do wonder whether the May time frame is still a reasonable one. And I know that there's reluctance to have major zoning amendments on a fall town meeting. So I perhaps I'll turn over that question to Lee Newman for a response on where we are on the timing.
Well, I would say the purpose of the traffic study, I think, was to identify what might be the worst build out scenario, and whether or not the infrastructure could be adequately modified to accommodate that build out. And if it was demonstrated that this was the worst case, this 1.35 at the use profile that we had modeled, we would use that as our foundational base to create the urban design plan and the zoning plan and the fiscal impact analysis. And that's doable, I think, by a May town meeting. But it means coming to the conclusion collectively that we're satisfied that this build out at the 1.35 can be adequately mitigated. And it makes sense to proceed at that density profile.
Okay. Mo, do you want to comment?
I do, and I agree with what Lee just said. To rezone this area doesn't mean to mandate a particular result. It means that you create an envelope within which you can get a result. And that envelope is managed essentially by the planning board and economic conditions. So I think it makes sense to proceed, and it creates an opportunity for a higher and better use of that site than currently, because I think you could argue the current use of that site is not a good gateway to the town, is not a particular economic advantage to the town given its potential. And so I think we should proceed if we can, given that this has been discussed for, I don't, remind me, Lee, how many years have we been talking about this?
At least 3.5.
So if you don't go
I
this
was going
year,
to say
then
about
it's
8.
Yeah, I mean, and sooner or later that property is going to turn over, and if it goes to another car dealership, do we want that to be the use in that site for the next 20 or 30 years? It seems to me that we have intellectual construct within which we can operate. And the only question is, how do you allow that to happen? And then what conditions do you place on that so the town can afford it? And part of that is, if there are certain expenses that come to the town beyond those you would impose on the developer, will the increase in taxes offset that to an advantageous degree for the residential residents of the town?
And I'd like to follow Mo's comment by saying, just following the business news, you see particularly the life sciences industry expanding into the suburbs, both north and south of us. I happen to see news about business going in Canton. And of course, we know that there's a lot of that happening in Waltham and Lexington. So why not us? This is a good site for that sort of use. And I would certainly like to see the rezoning that would encourage that kind of use for our town. And here we have a presentation that does show us how the build out that we envisioned as far as floor area ratio can be dealt with without detriment to the intersections if the mitigation measures are undertaken. I'm only speaking for myself, but as a member of the board, but we haven't discussed it as a board about going forward, but I'm inclined to be thinking we should go forward.
So I do note that while we all work together, that this is in fact planning board purview and work. And as I continue to say, I would strongly encourage that it's work that we should be undertaking, that it's absolutely in the town's best interest to be doing that. Paul, I saw you raised a hand.
Yeah. Yes, I'm unmuted. Yeah, in spite of my concerns that I expressed, I do want to agree with Mo that the current zoning is not tenable for this site. We should move forward with expanding the envelope as to what can be done. We will deal with the economic concerns and, you know, the traffic, who pays for the traffic mitigation and all those things when we have a special permit process, when we have a developer, but we should go forward with the rezoning to open it up to the possibilities and not just what we're looking at, but I believe that the use table that we have has a lot of possibilities, not just limiting it to office and R&D, but yeah, we should move forward and try to get this onto the spring town meeting. And I'm going to call it the spring rather than the May, because I'm not confident that we're going to have town meeting in May. I think we're going to have town meeting at the end of June again, which actually gives us a little bit more time. Thank you.
That definitely is still a mystery at the moment, but it's a likely scenario. Any other comments this morning? Barry.
Just one, and I apologize because I haven't reviewed, I guess, the proposed zoning changes. But in terms of making this, opening up this to a variety of possibilities that, you know, we now know some of the options for mitigating. I guess I worry a little bit that we put too tighter, that we're putting too rigid, I guess, an envelope, to use Mo's term, about what can be done there. You know, obviously, I think there's a lot of objection to big box retail, and residential seems to have been set aside as well as a potential use. But is there enough flexibility, I guess, in the zoning for a variety of different office flexibility for a developer to come in and you know, with whatever makes sense to them and they believe is the most and best use of that space that would be beneficial to the town as well? And I don't think we have to worry about, you know, whether it costs too much for them to mitigate the traffic. That's obviously, you know, they're gonna have to know that coming in and make the proposal. In my view, you know, taking that into account for whatever they want to develop.
And to that extent, the study that we've done here will help inform that for them as well. Barry, there's not specific zoning to actually evaluate yet, but I think that all this discussion informs the thinking that the planning board will undertake. And I think all of us agree that the degree of flexibility for developers to come in and see the future based on what's happening now will be valuable here. Mo?
Speaking for myself, I would not preclude housing here. I think that's a mistake because conditions do change. We have some desire for more diversity in our housing inventory, and we can set the conditions for that housing. I just think it's a mistake to preclude it, especially since it mitigates the traffic as well. So I realize there are school considerations and all the other stuff, but evidence is from our other multifamily housing developments that doesn't spin a lot of demand on the schools. So I wouldn't preclude it out of hand.
John and then Lee.
I agree with Mo. I wouldn't preclude housing either. I think that, you know, what we're talking about here is we're laying the groundwork for future reconstruction of this site. I think it's going to be a number of years before whatever we ultimately rezone and ultimately what is built comes to fruition. So I would absolutely be in favor of keeping a residential component on the table. I'd also like to throw out another idea just to keep it in the, you know, in the forefront, which is there is a group of people that was and may still be looking at a sports complex similar to the Wellesley Center on Route 9. And again, understanding that they would have to make this, forge this on their own and put together the dollars necessary to acquire and to construct on this site. I would hate to preclude that in zoning. as we move forward, and we will hear from them as well. Thank you.
Lee?
I guess just for me, before the planning board proceeds, I just want to make sure that there's a foundational agreement and understanding that we're talking about a build out under zoning of about a 1.35 FAR. And we showed you basically what we think is one of the worst cases in terms of a land use, in terms of its impact on infrastructure. And that what the platform for the zoning would be to take that 1.3 FAR and allow it to happen at this particular property. And that the use profile would be embedded in that density. So I just want to make sure that this group is collectively comfortable with this 1.35 FAR, its impacts, and that should be the foundational piece for the modeling going forward.
So I think I'm seeing a sense from the nods of the heads that yes, we have seen that and that we are comfortable with that as the base planning assumption.
Great, thank you very much.
John Conley.
I agree with the last several speakers with respect to the density aspect and looking at housing as some sort of housing there as being a permitted use. My concern is Gould Street and Central, and that clearly has the most reds or yellows in the excellent presentation that was made by GPI. I wonder what our ability would be to have any developer require them to sort of do work that far away from the land that they own. And with the present condition, and at least from my point of view, not seeing how it's ever going to get better, I wonder if the town should prioritize that intersection on its list of projects and get that to the front of the table rather than the middle or the back of the table. I think making that declaration, I think, would help sell this project at town meeting. And I think, I just think that we should look at that seriously and just not wait for the day when it's developed to address an intersection that is clearly antiquated and potentially, dangerous. And I think that would be best served by getting that to the front of our priorities rather than somewhere else in our list of priorities.
Kate, have we had a chance to look at where this particular intersection stands relative to other intersections? I know that was something we discussed when the.
What I can say is what's in the queue in the current capital plan is Highland at West and Central at Great Plain. So I can get the group the future planning after that, and the board can discuss whether to move those around. The Highland and West is already in design.
Okay. I think that's a good question, John. It is one that we had floated earlier, and I do think we should get the answer to that. Any other questions? If there are not, Jean?
Just a quickie. I don't know the exact route that's proposed, but I had an understanding that there was perhaps going to be a rerouting of the 58 bus that might bring it closer to this site. I should ask my husband, Steve, who serves on the Transportation Committee, but does anybody else who's on here today know about that rerouting and whether it would bring the bus route closer? Well, perhaps that's something just to think about, and I'll look into it. Thank you.
All right. I want to thank everybody for taking the time for this discussion this morning. I think it's been productive. It does give some guidance to the planning board, and I look forward to the planning board's next steps and understanding how we can all collectively work together to move this forward in a way that benefits the town. I do think for us all to adjourn, it's a somewhat complicated process where I think we all need to vote to adjourn. Do we need to do that?
This is it's a planning board meeting that your members at, so I think it's just a planning board vote.
Perfect. Jean, I'll turn it back to you. Oh, you need to unmute.
I'll ask a member of the planning board to offer a motion to adjourn.
I
So
move to adjourn. Second.
All right, so we
Yeah,
have
we'll
a
get to the
motion
right one.
and a second to adjourn. And I'll ask for a roll call vote on that. Mr. Alpert.
He's frozen.
He's frozen. So I'll ask Mr. Block.
Aye.
Yes. And
Was I frozen?
You
yes.
were.
Yes.
Okay, yes.
All right. So I think it's only the three of us,
Yes.
Adam Block and Paul Alpert and myself. So I also vote to adjourn. So we have the majority vote to adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. This was all very helpful.
Thank you, Rebecca and GPI.
Yes,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Great presentation, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you
Yes,
all.
indeed.